The night was thick with tension, the air heavy with the scent of impending blood. In the dimly lit atrium of the basilica, where the holy Bishop Martin was revered, the peace was shattered by the clashing of metal and the cries of men in mortal combat. Eberulf, a man feared and reviled by many, lay sprawled on the ground, his life draining away with the wine he had offered his guest. The atrium, once a place of prayer and reflection, now echoed with the sounds of violence and betrayal. Claudius, a man sent by King Guntram with a mission, stood over Eberulf, his sword dripping with the blood of his victim. Just moments ago, Claudius had sworn oaths of loyalty and friendship, his words as sweet as honey, but they were nothing more than a ruse. Eberulf, foolish and arrogant, had fallen for the deception, inviting Claudius into his quarters, thinking he had a new ally. As the servants of Eberulf scurried to fetch stronger wines, Claudius saw his opportunity. With a swift and brutal motion, he lunged at Eberulf, his sword slicing through the air. Eberulf, though trapped, fought back with a desperate fury, his dagger finding its mark under Claudius's armpit. But it was too little, too late. Claudius's men closed in, their swords slicing through flesh and bone, until Eberulf collapsed, his lifeless body a testament to his own hubris. Claudius, now a killer, was overcome with fear. The power of the holy Bishop Martin, whose sanctity Eberulf had so often despised, seemed to loom over him, a silent judge of his actions. He fled to the abbot's cell, his heart pounding with the weight of his crime. "A great crime has been committed," Claudius gasped, his voice trembling. "Without your help, we'll be destroyed." The abbot, a man of God, looked at Claudius with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "You have brought this upon yourself," he said, his voice steady. "But the mercy of the Lord is boundless. Pray, and perhaps you will find a path to redemption." Outside the night grew colder, the shadows of the basilica stretching long and dark. The city of Tours, unaware of the violence that had unfolded within its sacred walls, continued to sleep. But for those who had witnessed the betrayal, the night would never be the same. Eberulf's fate was a stark reminder of the dangers of pride and the consequences of turning one's back on the divine. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with whispers of the murder. King Guntram, who had sent Claudius on his mission, would have to decide how to deal with the aftermath. But for now, the atrium was a crime scene, and the holy basilica, once a place of peace, was a place of shadows and secrets. The city of Convenae stood on a hill, its walls strong and its citizens loyal. Gundovald, who claimed to be the son of King Clothar, had arrived with a group of supporters, including Bishop Sagittarius, Dukes Mummolus and Bladast, and others. The city's people welcomed him, bringing their food and supplies inside the walls, just as Gundovald had asked. As the days of Lent began, Gundovald addressed the citizens, telling them that he was their rightful king, and that they should stand together against King Guntram's approaching army. He promised that with their help, they could hold out until divine mercy came to their aid. The citizens, believing his words, prepared for a siege, but Guntram had other plans. He sent a letter to Gundovald, supposedly from Queen Brunhild, suggesting that if Gundovald left the army and ordered it to retreat, he could withdraw to Bordeaux. It was a trick designed to learn more about Gundovald's intentions. Gundovald, however, didn't leave. Instead, he told the citizens to go out and face the approaching army. As the citizens left, Gundovald's men seized the gates and closed them, locking the citizens out. They took control of the city, finding large stores of grain and wine. If they could hold out, they would have enough food for a long time. Meanwhile, Guntram's army, led by Duke Ludogisil, was closing in. They heard that Gundovald had taken up a position on the bank of the Garonne River with a large force and had treasure taken from Fredegund. They attacked, swimming their horses across the river and losing many men in the process. But they pressed on, finding camels and exhausted horses that Gundovald had abandoned, heavily laden with gold and silver. The army then reached the Basilica of St. Vincent, where the locals had hidden their valuables, thinking the holy place would protect them. The soldiers set fire to the basilica's doors, looted the valuables, and took the sacred utensils. But God's vengeance was swift. Many men's hands were burned, and some were driven mad, shouting the name of the martyr. Most of the soldiers were so scared that they wounded themselves with their own weapons. The rest of the army, now more cautious, continued their march. They arrived at Convenae and set up camp around the city. They plundered the nearby lands, and some who ventured too far were killed by the locals. Many of Guntram's men climbed the hill and taunted Gundovald, calling him a painter and a pretender. "Are you the one who used to decorate oratories in Clothar's time?" they shouted. "Are you the one they called Balamer, who brought you here and who gave you the nerve to set foot in this kingdom?" Gundovald, standing above the gateway, responded, "Everyone knows that my father Clothar hated me. He cut my hair short, and so did my brothers. I joined Narses in Italy, married, and had 2 sons. After my wife died, I went to Constantinople, where I lived for many years. Guntram Boso came to me and told me that my brothers were dead, and only Guntram and Childebert remained. He invited me to return, and I came, trusting his oaths, but he betrayed me, taking my treasures for himself." The siege of Convenae continued, with Gundovald's fate hanging in the balance. The city stood strong, but the tide of battle could turn at any moment. In the heat of summer, the city of Orleans welcomed King Guntram, a man known for his wisdom and generosity. This was the 24th year of his reign, and he had come from the city of Nevers, passing through the region to visit Orleans. The people of Orleans were overjoyed to see their king. They lined the streets, waving banners and shouting, "Long live the king! May his reign last countless years." Even the Jewish community joined in, adding their voices to the cheers. When the king arrived, the city threw a grand celebration. The air was filled with the sounds of different languages. Syrians, Latins, and Jews all joined in the festivities. The king was invited to many homes, where he enjoyed meals and gave generous gifts to his hosts. On the 4th of July, the feast day of St. Martin, the king attended Mass and then had a lavish dinner. During the meal, the king noticed that the Jews were particularly enthusiastic in their praise. He remarked, "Woe to the Jewish people, who live on the edge of deceit. They shout praises because they want me to rebuild their synagogue at public expense. By God's command, I will never do that." After the meal, the king asked the bishops present to bless him the next day. He wanted to receive their spiritual guidance and be saved from sin. The bishops agreed, and the king left the dinner in good spirits. The next morning, the king visited several holy places to pray. One of these was the Basilica of St. Avitus, where I, the chronicler, lived. I was honored to meet the king and offered him the blessed bread of St. Martin. The king accepted and even invited me to join him for dinner later. However, the king's mood was not entirely pleasant. He was still angry with 2 bishops, Bertram of Bordeaux and Palladius of Saints, for supporting Gundovald, a man who had claimed to be the king's brother. The king had already questioned them about why they had welcomed Gundovald, and why they had consecrated a new bishop, Faustin Indax. Bishop Palladius had tried to shift the blame to his metropolitan Bertram, but the king was not convinced. When the king saw Bertram at the dinner, he asked, "Who is this one?" Bertram reminded the king that they were kinsmen, but the king was not pleased. He said, "You should not have brought a plague from abroad on your own kind." Then the king turned to Bishop Palladius and said, "You have not earned my thanks either. You have perjured yourself to me 3 times, sending me messages full of deceit. God will judge my cause, for I have always tried to treat you as fathers of the church, and you have been treacherous to me." The king then asked 2 other bishops, Nicasius of Angoulême and Antidius of Agen, what they had done for their regions and the kingdom. The bishops, knowing the king's mood, likely responded with great care. Despite his anger, the king's visit to Orleans was a significant event, showing his connection to the people and his deep faith. The city of Orleans, with its mix of cultures and its rich history, provided a fitting backdrop for the king's presence, a reminder of the complex and often challenging relationships between the monarchy and the church. The king, after washing his hands and receiving a blessing from the bishops, sat down at the table with a smile, as if nothing had troubled him. The dinner was halfway through, when he asked me to have the deacon sing. The deacon, who had sung the responsorium at the Mass the day before, began to sing. The king, pleased, asked each bishop to choose a cleric from their church to sing before him. Each cleric sang their best, and the king listened with a contented look. As the courses were served, the king spoke about the silver he now owned, which had once belonged to Mammalus, a man he accused of being a perjurer. He had already broken up 15 of Mammalus's silver dishes, keeping only 2. He said he had no other son but Childebert, who had enough treasure from his father's inheritance and from the wealth seized from Mammalus's property in Avignon. The king planned to distribute the rest to the poor and the churches. He then asked the priests to pray for Childebert, praising him as a man of sense and ability. He believed that if God allowed Childebert to rule Gaul, their lineage could rise again. He shared a story about Childebert's birth on Easter, when the deacon was reading from the Gospels and a messenger announced the birth. Everyone cried out, "Glory to Almighty God." Childebert was baptized on Pentecost and crowned on Christmas, and the king believed these holy days were a sign of God's favor. The king also talked about his fearlessness against Brunhild, who threatened to kill him. He trusted that God, who had saved him from his enemies, would protect him from her plots. He then spoke angrily about Bishop Theodore of Marseilles, saying he would exile him if he came to the synod. The king accused Theodore of being involved in the death of his brother Chilperic, and vowed to avenge him. When I reminded the king that Chilperic's death was due to his own actions and his prayers, he shared a dream he had. In the dream, Chilperic was brought to him in chains by 3 bishops. 2 bishops begged for mercy, but Bishop Tetricus demanded that Chilperic be burned. The king saw a cauldron boiling, and Chilperic was thrown in, dissolving completely. We were all amazed, and the banquet ended. The next day the king went hunting. When he returned, I brought forward Garachar, Count of Bordeaux, and Bladast, who had taken refuge in the Basilica of St. Martin because they had supported Gundovald. The king, after scolding them for their disloyalty, forgave them and returned their possessions. On Sunday, the king went to church for Mass. Bishop Palladius was chosen to conduct the service, but the king, remembering Palladius's past disloyalty, ordered him to stop. The bishops intervened, reminding the king that he had received a blessing from Palladius at the banquet. The king allowed Palladius to finish, but warned him about future behavior. When Palladius and Bertram were called to the king's table, they began accusing each other of various sins, including adultery and perjury. Many laughed, but some were disturbed by the bishop's behavior. They left the king's presence, promising to appear at the synod. The king then went to Paris and spoke about Chilperic's son, who had not been brought to him for baptism. He suspected that the child was not of royal blood. Queen Fredegund, Chilperic's wife, gathered her supporters and swore that the boy was Chilperic's son, which satisfied the king. Later, a man came to the king with information about the bodies of Chilperic's sons, Merovich and Clovis. The king, after swearing to protect the man, learned that Clovis had been buried under the eaves of an oratory and then thrown into the Marne River. The man found Clovis's body in a fish weir and buried it on the bank. The king, verifying the story, had the body exhumed and moved to the Basilica of St. Vincent for a proper burial. He then sent for Merovich's body and buried it next to Clovis. A doorkeeper accused another of plotting to kill the king. The accused was tortured but revealed nothing. The king suspected a jealous plot, and the accused was released. The king then returned to Cahors and had Bontus, who had been disloyal, killed. The king also tried to bring charges against Bishop Theodore of Marseilles again. Duke Rotharius, sent to investigate, arrested Theodore and sent him to the king. However, divine vengeance struck Rotharius's household, and Theodore was unharmed. The king sent envoys to his nephew Childebert, who was staying at Coblentz. The envoy Felix asked why Childebert was not attending the council at Troyes. I responded, saying that there was no discord between the 2 kings. Childebert, in private, asked the king to spare Bishop Theodore, warning that it would cause a quarrel between them. The envoy returned with an answer. Childebert, facing pressure from imperial messengers for gold, sent an army to Italy, but the generals quarreled and returned without success. Meanwhile, Duke Wintrio was driven out of his duchy, but later restored. Eulalius became Count of Clermont, and Nistius, after giving gifts to the king, was appointed Duke of Clermont, Rodez, and Uzes. King Guntram wanted to control his nephew Clothar's kingdom, and appointed Theodulf as Count of Angers. Theodulf was initially driven out, but later returned with Duke Sigewulf's help. Gundovald and Werpen competed for the countship of Meaux. Gundovald won, but Werpen later killed him. Gundovald's kinsmen retaliated, and both men lost their lives and their positions. Finally, the bishops gathered at Macon for the synod. Faustin, who had been made Bishop of Dax by Gundovald, was removed from office. Bertram, Orsts, and Palladius were required to support him with gold. Nistius, a former layman, became the new bishop of Dax. Ursinus, Bishop of Cahors, was excommunicated for supporting Gundovald and was ordered to do penance. A bishop at the council argued that women could not be included in the term man, but he accepted the reasoning of his peers and said no more. The year was 585, and the land was filled with turmoil and intrigue. Bishop Praetextatus, who had once been exiled but had returned to Rouen, faced a grave threat. His prayers, though praised by some, were criticized by others for not adhering to literary form. But despite the criticism, his words were fit for the church and decent. Meanwhile, King Guntram fell gravely ill, leading many to believe he might not recover. Some thought this was God's way of stopping the king from exiling more bishops. During this time, Bishop Theodore returned to his city, greeted with cheers and applause from the people. King Childebert held an assembly at his villa in the Ardennes. Queen Brunhild spoke about her daughter in Gund, who was still held in Africa, but her plea received little sympathy. At this assembly, a case was brought against Guntram, who had stolen jewelry from a basilica. When confronted, he fled, and all his property was taken from him. Bertram, the Bishop of Bordeaux, fell ill and died after assigning his duties to Waldo the deacon. However, the king appointed Gundovald, called Dodo, as the new bishop instead. This caused tension among the clerics, who were later punished by Bishop Palladius. Wandelin, the governor of King Childebert, died, and the queen mother, Brunhild, took control of her son's affairs. She wanted to rule on her own terms. Aenodius was made the new Duke of Tours and Poitiers, while Berulf, who had been suspected of stealing treasures, was tricked and stripped of his property. He and his accomplice were saved from execution by the intervention of bishops, but lost everything they had. Duke Desiderius, who had been out of favor, was brought back into the king's good graces after the intervention of several bishops. Eulalius, who had intended to bring a suit against Desiderius, was silenced by laughter and humiliation. Ingund, the daughter of Queen Brunhild, died in Africa, and her husband Hermenegild was executed by his own father, Leovigild. This news deeply troubled King Guntram, who decided to send an army into Spain to conquer Septimania. However, the campaign was a disaster, marked by plunder and violence. The leaders of the army, when brought before King Guntram, were spared execution but were severely reprimanded. Fredegund, the queen, sent assassins to kill King Childebert. The assassins were caught and executed, and the king's army was ordered to prepare for a new campaign against the Goths. In Rouen, Fredegund had a bitter argument with Bishop Praetextatus, who warned her of God's judgment. On Easter Sunday, as the bishop was conducting services, an assassin stabbed him. Despite the bishop's cries for help, no one came to his aid. He was carried to his chamber, where he died, cursing Fredegund for her crimes. Romachar, the bishop of Coutances, came to bury Praetextatus. The citizens of Rouen were grief-stricken, and one of their leaders warned Fredegund that her evil deeds would not go unpunished. Thus, the year 585 was marked by betrayal, violence, and the fall of many powerful figures. The land was left in a state of uncertainty, with the future hanging in the balance.